Chapter 6, Island in the Sky. Fairy stories are not stories about fairies or elves, but stories about fairy, that is, fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. J.R.R. Tolkien, from Tolkien on Fairy Stories. I should have pronounced that dwarfs. That was Pavlovian, I suppose. He spelled it dwarfs for a reason. Has to do with Disney. We're not going to get into it. All right, here we go. The first time Himari Fujimoto was in the clear place, she encountered demons, but they sought to pass themselves off as some sort of elves. The cat led her to them, though incidentally. On the island of cats, she saw the one with the white paw who visited her in the hospital. Himari hadn't known whether the cat were real. It came once in the night from under the bed. Suddenly there was a cat in her room, and this was not normal. Her first reaction was one of irritation. It was time to sleep, and now she could not sleep, and this would affect her throughout the following day, and then she would be tired again, and it was a mess. So her first reaction was to lie still, watching the cat out of the corner of her eye and trying to pretend it wasn't there. But it was there, and she couldn't ignore it. Finally, she sat up in bed, and the cat reacted, bowing up on its legs and puffing its fur out. Then it puked, and somebody turned off a light under the bed. This startled Himari, and she yelled, prompting the cat to run under a desk, curl his tail around his paws, and watch her. She was paralyzed, trying to process what she should do, then decided the puke had to be cleaned because the floors had to stay clean. Everybody knew the floors had to stay clean, and then she thought, well, now the cat would be hungry because cats are always hungry, and it no longer had the food that was in its belly before, so she went to the mini-fridge in the room and pulled out a bag of beef jerky, which she kept in the mini-fridge so it stayed fresh longer and was harder to chew, which meant she didn't eat too much of it at once, which meant one bag lasted longer, which meant she had more money for more things like beef jerky. She offered some to the cat. The cat accepted immediately and was suddenly quite friendly, to the point where he would now come and lay beside her on the bed, and so she fell asleep. When she woke in the morning, there was no cat, and Himari at first thought it must have been a dream, so she checked the garbage and saw the contents of the cat's stomach and a tissue where she dropped them. Himari looked under the bed but saw nothing. She inspected every inch of the room but found nowhere the cat could have entered through. The windows were too high even for her to reach, and always closed at the hospital. Then she realized she was investigating too long and would miss the bus to the library. It was Monday. Monday was library day. She couldn't miss the bus to the library. She'd never taken the one that came an hour later. This was intolerable. She left and resumed her normal schedule for the day, barely making the first bus, and in the excitement all but forgetting about the cat, except to recall the cat was fond of beef jerky. She must always have beef jerky now, in case she saw the animal again. Months later, at the Island of Cats on a Tuesday was community excursion day, she identified him by his white paw and long silky black fur. Again, he accepted her gift of beef jerky, but this time, after he decided he wanted a change of scenery for whatever feline reason, he padded slowly off. Himari followed, if cautiously, and in a sideways manner reminiscent of a crab. The cat eventually made his way some distance from other felines on the island, looked at a certain point off in the distance, and began to purr. Like ripples on water, air began to swim, until an oval portrait of another world emerged, tall as a door, with a gentle bass sound and a flash. Himari was afraid to look at it for a moment, but the cat, she would call him White Paw for his white paw. White Paw, he made a trilling noise, and padded right in. So Himari followed. When she stepped through, The air she first inhaled hit her like electricity, and her eyes somehow seemed more keen and able than before. Her first response was to laugh in exhilaration, but then she heard the cat begin to retch, and there was a subtle thumping shift. Himari turned around, and the island of cats with its tourists and merchants was gone. The portal was closed. She immediately shrieked. The cat finished puking, ran to her, and began nuzzling around her legs in what seemed a desperate attempt to calm her. Himari slammed her eyes shut, fell onto the soft bed of flowers she found herself in, and found herself rocking back and forth amid moans of fear. White Paw purred and curled atop her head, then began kneading her shoulders. Himari cried and slept for hours, breathing in the deep air. When she awoke, she felt more calm than she had in a long time. But the dream world remained, so at last she let herself really look at it, staring confusedly about like a fawn would had it stumbled into an office building. White Paw began trilling again. Pleased, she decided to part with her nap. He stood up, stretched, and worked his paws in the green earth. It wasn't really earth. It was the tightest grouping of multicolored flowers Himari ever saw, and they gave way to ferns, which gave way to very tall trees all about. It was quiet, such that she thought it was utterly silent until she heard faint rustling far above. Light was minimal but adequate, like early morning or evening. There was a very slight breeze that came and went, and when she looked all the way back, she could see, high among the tops of the trees, where leaves danced in that breeze. "Is anybody out there?" Himari yelled as loud as she could. Her voice echoed back at her, followed by deep silence. White Paw immediately ran to Himari and started nuzzling her legs again, as if encouraging her not to be too loud. Okay, she said, and scratched him behind the ears. He jumped and bapped her playfully on the head, then returned to the path he found in the foliage and began to walk with a typical Tom strut. Himari swallowed and followed, trying not to shake. Her fingers were dancing patterns madly through the air, and her mind was racing, but it was racing in a more linear way than it normally did. The air somehow made it more clear. They were coming to the edge of the trees, and Himari realized there was indeed a bit of a trail, deer-sized or cat-sized, along which White Paw was padding. They came up over a very gentle hill, and to her right, Himari spied a tiny, clean brook of water flowing. As she followed its origin, she saw it curved upward quite sharply, almost becoming a waterfall, and there was white snow in the distance. The water was so clear. White Paw sauntered over to it and began to drink. "You shouldn't drink water that isn't properly purified," Himari said. White Paw twitched an ear. "Water that isn't properly purified has germs from animal sewage, waste, and from parasites," White Paw. "Wild water that isn't running water is dirty water. It isn't clean." The cat stopped drinking for a second, looked at her, then turned back to the stream and continued drinking. Himari continued, "You shouldn't drink the bad water, White Paw." But he ignored her. In her little memorized mantra, she neglected to consider indeed this was running water. It was not stagnant, but the details of what she was seeing were blocked by the information chunk which gave her this opinion. Still, she was pretty thirsty. Eventually, she knelt down beside him and began to scratch his head, and he purred. She noticed her thirst, and before she realized what she was doing, had taken a hand and dipped some of the water into her mouth. It was very cold and very sweet, and it was exactly what her body wanted. She drank and drank, and then suddenly realized what she had done and stood up with red cheeks, saying, "I'm going to be sick!" The cat now jumped from the water and began nuzzling around her legs. Himari looked down and chanced to catch herself in the water. She forgot she was wearing the blue beret. It was tight enough it stayed even during her nap. Her hair was short and came just past her chin. She had a vague look in her eye, but less vague than she normally saw in a mirror. She wore a t-shirt with an anime corgi over a thin sweater under a jean jacket, and a matching jean skirt to her ankles. Under the skirt, she had leggings to keep warm. She'd worn her only boots that day because they were going to an island, and islands have unknown areas, and unknown areas have rough terrain sometimes. They were neon green boots, but with a fashionable enough design, targeted toward youthful preferences. She wondered what would happen if she were sick on her reflection in the stream. Is that why the cat was always sick? Because it drank such water? But she felt fine. Himari straightened up and looked at the cat, who seemed to roll his eyes and continue following the stream away from its source. She wiped her mouth and let him lead until the trees widened out and she heard the sound of water falling. It took Himari a moment to realize what she was looking at. There were so many clouds, and they seemed so close, but the sky was violet as the dawn had not come. It would come very soon indeed, but had not yet. And the clouds were moving very fast, but then she realized something. As she looked outward, the clouds became sky, and the sky became something that undulated like a sea, until she realized it wasn't undulating, it was moving. The ground was drifting past. They were flying above a wild, massive forest covered in a low layer of mist, maybe 300 feet below. The stream emptied into the air and trailed water behind as they slowly drifted by. The forest began a mild list as if being drawn outward, then gave way to a beautiful meadow that stretched for miles and miles and came to a tree that reached far into the sky and higher than Himari's view at level. There were shapes coming and going near that fantastically huge tree, bright, glowing shapes, dark violet shapes, and a circle of large cylindrical objects that would come and go into a knothole like an aircraft carrier. The tree had gold and purple bark in competing spirals. Two great limbs extended upward 2 directions, with the trunk portion reaching for the sky between them. It was a tree that appeared to have features of fir trees and features of those with more delicate leaves. That is incorrect, Himari observed, and crossed her arms. Then she remembered why the ground wandered by as it did, and the clouds, and the water falling away, and a wave of vertigo knocked her backward. She quickly leaned into the flowers and hugged her legs. Somehow this forest she was in, or on, this forest was floating. Himari got on her belly and crawled to the edge of the island in the sky, looking down where the water drifted by. She could see roots trailing from the bottom of the island, large bulbous roots, and there was a gassy smell to them. They were like beets, bulbous at the top and tapering to wisps she could see trailing behind the floating island. Then she saw something below that made her pause. A great canyon was between the meadows, and the canyon was black and dead inside, but for colored bits of something she couldn't distinguish. It zigzagged slowly toward the tree, and she realized it was a hollowed-out, dead root, and its color matched the spiral part of the tree that was purple. The canyon below was monstrous, the tree ahead smaller. She must be drifting away from the tree, and it must be very large indeed. Completely incorrect, she reiterated. White Paw made a noise and leaned his paws on her shoulders. She inched away from the edge. He hopped off and continued near the precipice unconcerned. Himari followed, but closer to the tree line. In about a half hour, they made a circuit of the entire island floating across the violet sky, drifting to the dawn, ending where the stream trailed away. It couldn't have been more than a mile in circumference, and it was irregular, like a patch from a pair of pants designed for camouflage. It had mild hills, and in its center was a very steep upthrust of rock that was dusted in snow. The forest was only a few hundred feet thick, and the rest was mountain. It was a miniature ecosystem on the fly. As Himari followed the cat around this tiny floating curiosity in the clear place, she saw mountains surrounding the valley with the tree, and as the island in the sky drifted away, the tree got smaller and smaller. She watched the seashore and the sea come to replace it. Gradually, the floating island continued its drift over deep undulating waters shrouded in mist, ever chasing the dawn. Her mind and body were more peaceful than they would have been were things following their normal course, perhaps because of the thick air. She had enough clarity to consider, what if her routine were decisively disordered? What if disorder were the routine? What if it were all backward and routine was what should make her feel anxious? What if she could think this way? She had begun a psychological adjustment that would be crucial in her survival very soon. Himari then noticed the very nearby flashing lights for the first time, but only after her incidental breakthrough. There were little golden lights flickering here and there at intervals throughout the floating forest like fat fireflies, and having a sudden idea, she looked quickly to her left. There was one of the lights, right near her, but it floated away before she could get real close to it. The cat flopped down in a particular clearing of heather and began to groom himself. Himari sat and joined him, watching the land fall away further and the sea grow larger and the dawn never fully break. It was just an ever-growing brightness on the sea. She realized it must have been several hours, but the sun had still not come. But weren't they heading toward it? Himari was perplexed. Sometimes as they drifted, she would see one of the cylinders pass nearby, like those that were small against that mountainous tree. They were always going in a straight line and very fast, often disappearing. That's when the event happened. One of the cylinders came very near and began to hover right in front of Himari. It twinkled with green and purple lights in abundance and looked like multiple smaller cylinders of a wide orientation had been crunched together, a spine compacted as an accordion. It hummed in a menacing way, and Himari felt a cold fear coming at her in waves. Then something happened that was directly rooted in how her brain was wired. Himari's mind was full of an innocence of thought that suffered no guile. It wasn't that she couldn't be wicked if she so chose. It's that she hadn't so chose and had no reason to so choose because everything was on schedule and she was getting her list finished every day. Well, not now, of course, but generally. When things followed the routine, everything was fine. Things just had to follow the routine. Impediments to routine didn't initiate hatred, jealousy, avarice, or anything like that in Himari. They evinced fear, surprise, and sometimes a bit of anger. But these were all honestly rooted. Even the kindest pup can become angry at something irrelevant if it gets the wrong idea. But since Himari had trouble understanding people and the world and people generally had shuffled her off to a group living facility, she had no chance to really understand many things. She also had no one to explain certain things to her, and so formed a rudimentary idea of reality based around a scheduled, safe, predictable, expectable routine of necessities, from grooming to eating, from day to day, from week to week, from month to month, and on through the years. It is a mercy whatever quality of air or water in the clear place ordered her mind as it did, she would have been... it is a mercy whatever quality of air or water in the clear place ordered her mind as it did. She would have been in an instinctual pattern of dismay at her routine being totally abandoned. Her initial tears and sleep were part of that reaction, but the air was different and the clouds fading away. She was hearing the melody of a new, unknown song, one with which she longed to sing along. So when the cylinder sprayed a mist with a foreboding smell, White Paw quickly ran deep into the forest and hid. Himari could not avoid the mist, and as her mind received the odor, she leaned down on the soft flowers and began to see things. First she saw a little creature with dark black eyes and pale skin, then half a dozen of them, standing around her. But she couldn't move. The fear came in ever steeper waves, but as she regarded them, the creatures shifted and changed to a conglomeration of neon colors that were deep, vibrant, and haunting. They had a quality to them that was mischievous and full of humor, not good humor, the kind that revels in the pain of others. Himari found nothing to make her laugh in their cavorting dancing games. They kept running up to her and showing her things, shapes mostly. They wanted her to think their care for her was inconceivably vast, but she couldn't understand the concept of legitimate care, much less its synthetic progression, its synthetic projection. There were also sounds and smells she could see for some reason. As she watched, the beings clarified from abstract geometric shapes to creatures that looked like a perverse cross between a human being and an iguana. Their faces were reminiscent of a human, but sharper, with the eyes going the wrong way where the pupil was. Their hair was all neon red and long and wide, flowing out behind them like a mane. The skin was still pale, but began to look scaly, and as though colors were running over it. There was an iridescent quality to their skin. Their noses were red and bulbous, and their mouths were grinning and looked like they were covered in paint, blood, or lipstick. In fact, they looked like some sort of evil lizard clowns. The comparison in Himari's mind was reinforced by their behavior. They laughed uproariously and told deep jokes about the nature of reality, and their eyes pulled at Himari, inviting her to climb aboard the marauding glee in their broken minds. It was at this point that she was reminded of an anime film that terrified her as a child. It was about a woman who could go in and out of dreams. She was named after some sort of spice. People got infected by this dream that made them crazy, and the eyes of the dolls and the infected, and the song they sang, and the vivid colors, this was just like that. So Himari screamed at the creatures, and they retracted as she said, "You have the brain sickness! You have the brain sickness!" They cackled and tried to make a joke, showing her how everybody went a little loopy on occasion, and what of it? But Himari was having none of that. She screamed at them, "You have the brain sickness!" They began to fade, and Himari was on the floating island again, half asleep in the flowers. As her eyes refocused, she saw the cylinder slowly retreating, and then it moved faster, and disappeared. She perceived a presence suddenly. There was now in the corner of her eye a glowing face that became one like that of her father with his beard and balalaika. It wasn't her father, but it was like him in that it was bearded and not Japanese. She didn't know much else about her dad. She only knew her father from one picture. He was the balalaika man, and this is how she referred to him. She only knew that picture from incidentally seeing it in her mother's room, but she asked her mother, and her mother told her he bought a farm somewhere, and then played the drinking game as she was so fond of doing. The glowing face said, "Well done," and then became a firefly and disappeared into the forest. Himari sat up. White Paw was nowhere to be seen, so she walked into the forest calling his name, remembering he retreated there. "White Paw!" she cried. "White Paw!" Yet she could not find him. Soon she curled up in a ball and waited by the stream a long ways from the edge of the floating island, lest any of those cylinders should come and try to break her mind again. Her brain was already in rough enough shape as it was. This thought made her laugh a few times because she knew it should be funny, but somehow this did not feel funny, nor did forcing laughter make her feel better, so she quit. Lying near the stream, she noticed little rocks, little sparkling rocks, and little stones worn smooth by waters over time. They were very pretty. She collected several and stood looking for more. She managed to forget herself for a time, walking about the island, collecting pretty stones, until eventually she got a great pile of treasures, too great for her to carry in her pockets. Maybe this could be where she kept her treasures. Maybe there were more treasures to find in the clear place. But after a few more circuits of the island, she saw no more treasures, and so sat down again by the stream. She looked high into the twilight sky. It was still before dawn, but she could see the odd star faint with distance. "What do I do now?" she asked. She didn't hear anything, and so buried her head in her knees again. It was another hour before White Paw showed up, rubbing up against her like he never left. "White Paw! There you are. Thank you for showing me this place of yours. But, I missed my schedule. I think I should get home now because I have missed my schedule. And I don't know how long I've missed my schedule for, but it's never a good idea to miss the schedule. And you can have a vacation sometimes, but you have to come back from the vacation. And I think I need to come back from the vacation now. So if I feed you some more beef jerky, will you take me back? Please take me back, White Paw. Please take me back to the hospital." White Paw leaned his forepaws on her belly and stretched, saying, "Meow." "Okay, it's a deal." She gave him some beef jerky and waited. He lay down and took a nap. Himari considered that the custom of cats was to follow their own schedule, and so she decided she would wait for him to resume his. This time she did not allow herself to sleep and kept petting White Paw, hoping he would wake, but it just seemed to make him more comfortable in his feline dreams. Finally he roused, stretched, and began to saunter off into the woods. Himari followed. He stopped at a point facing a bit of rock at an angle against the cone of stone at the center of the floating island. He looked at it and began to purr. It became a city street in Tokyo, one right near the hospital. She knew it well. She gave him a piece of beef jerky and stepped through. When she looked back, she could see White Paw hovering in the air mid-jump, and in slow motion he drifted toward her until his tail was out of the clear place, and he landed, moving normally. He stopped for a moment and heaved, bringing up the jerky. The portal closed behind, and they were on an empty sidewalk several streets away from her hospital. Wiping the fur around his mouth with his White Paw looked up at Himari and said, "Oh, yes, sorry," and she gave him a bit of jerky, which he ate greedily. She felt suddenly very tired, but things were still too strange for her to allow herself to give in to drowsiness. So Himari began to walk home, but something was wrong. The air here, it was like a soup, and it had an ugly smell. And everything was foggy, but there wasn't a fog, but everything was foggy. She would focus on something, but thinking fog got in the way, and she started getting lost in the details relevant to her schedule. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Himari knew that she would never be able to think as clearly in this place, because this was how her thinking had always been. But in the other place. She was startled out of the train of thought by an interruption of routine. The digital sign near the corner bank. It had a number for the day that was 2 days later than it should have been. Either the bank was wrong, or Himari had been gone too long. Himari immediately looked at the sidewalk and began to calculate, saying the numbers as she counted them and thinking about it. It was a good thing she looked down so soon, because following the day and the month on the sign was the year. And this incongruity would have arrested Himari for a very long time, making her miss curfew. She was gone but 2 days in her mind. In reality, she was gone 4 years. To Himari, 2 days was already a long time. Time enough to get in real trouble with the nurses. Well, but it wasn't a very long time. She could explain 2 days. It was only 2 days. Himari scratched White Paw behind the ears, said, "I've got to go back fast. Come with me?" She tried to pick him up, but he became liquid and wouldn't let her, so she said, "Okay, have it your way. Come back to see me." "Oh," said White Paw, disappearing into the night with no further fanfare. Himari began running in her green boots back to her room at the hospital. When she arrived to find a room occupied by a different resident, because it was suspected she died 4 years ago and most of the staff were different, save the grim night nurse who did recognize her, and almost all the residents were different, it sent her into shock, and she stayed in such a mental space for a solid week. When White Paw returned from under the bed at the end of that week, she followed him beneath the creaky frame this time, knowing he had a portal somewhere. In fact, he did, and it was a smaller one, and she had to squeeze through it, and it came out not on an island, but atop a low mountain with a view to a wide wall made of jewels the size of cities and stretching away forever in all directions. It was a wall higher than the mountains before it, which were themselves higher than that on which Himari stood, and many miles away. The golden wall was not surpassed by even sky, reaching to infinity, its true height lost beyond clouds. It glowed brighter than anything she had yet seen in the clear place and seemed utterly endless. She had to shield her eyes, and everything felt pleasantly warm. White Paw noted, and began to pad off down a little dirt path he must have established in his rounds. Suddenly he stopped a moment and brought up his lunch. Himari was quick with more beef jerky. He purred his thanks, looked behind. Looking behind, she saw the gateway under her bed in the rock of the low mountain was closed. There was a mechanism here. When White Paw went through and retched, the portal closed. It stayed open until then. Something was connected to the cat, so the transition took something from him. But Himari provided what he lost through the beef jerky. So he broke even. She supposed this must be White Paw's rationale. Maybe she could be useful to him and he to her. So began the odyssey of Himari Fujimoto. She would not leave White Paw's side, and every step she took with him, the air of the clear place gave her vitality. It made her more level-headed. She was able to focus on one thing and another and switch between the two ways of thinking easier and easier. This was a drink of fresh water for her mind, and too refreshing not to revel in. Himari followed White Paw, and in the clear place, she didn't realize it at first, but she felt no hunger. It hardly felt like 2 days went by the first time she came, and when White Paw jumped out and she saw, she remembered how slowly he floated through the air. Something was off with time here. Himari began to learn how she could get White Paw to take her to her home world, where she was used to time in the dark air. It was muddled, but she could get a routine. On a certain level, she got to where she could communicate with White Paw. But when she ran out of beef jerky, there came a dramatic time. Eventually, he made a jump that landed them in a gas station bathroom. Coming out of it, she found and grabbed all the beef jerky she could hold while the attendant looked at her, wondering how he missed her entry. No one saw her come through the front door, not even the cameras. Then she ran back to the bathroom where White Paw was waiting, dripping beef jerky bags behind her as they slipped from her wide grasp. The attendant also waited, crossing his arms, thinking how to address this situation. But after a half hour passed, without anyone leaving the ladies' room, he went and he used the manager's key to unlock the door, and there was no one in the bathroom, and there was no beef jerky. It became a ghost story for that prefecture, especially when the store's surveillance footage of Himari was matched with missing persons media circulating the web. Himari had no idea she was becoming the next Slender Man, but for gas station attendants at 3 a.m. Over time, she began to notice a trend. Seldom did Himari spend more than an hour at once in the clear place. Normally, White Paw would make a portal, puke, walk to another portal, and jump through it again, where he would begin his new nap. He had a cycle of napping locales, and a routine generally, as Himari noted from the start. Over the following months, Himari began to understand that routine and see how it worked and combine it with her own. There was a shape to portal distribution. It was like those funny neon-colored images on computers if you left them idle too long. She squinted, thinking about it as she followed behind White Paw one day, muttering the English words, "Fractura screensaver." Like those images, the pattern of the portals was of an irregular shape, but not one without a pattern. Himari was good at patterns. Soon she realized the difference was an added element. Fractal patterns could be zoomed in infinitely because they were number relationships personified by colors in a particular set. And they never ended. There were really only 2 axes in which numbers in a set and numbers out of a set were used. In the clear place, I need to go back. And they never ended. However, no matter what beautiful gyrating images developed, these were always in 2 dimensions. There were really only 2 axes on which numbers in a set and numbers out of a set were used. In the clear place, the portals followed fractal shapes around a 3rd axis, a z-axis. So fractals the screensavers used were data in and out of the set separated by color schemes in 2 dimensions. Add a 3rd dimension, and the pattern for the clear world and real world portals was almost apparent. Soon she was able to predict this pattern, as naturally she just followed where the next point would be along the 3-dimensional shape in her mind. So she could find spots White Paw hadn't explored before, but where he could explore if he decided to, portals he hadn't opened yet. When she thought they were near one, she would hold out some beef jerky, and when White Paw tried to leave, she would keep situating him in front of the spot where she thought a hole might be. Finally, he would capitulate, purr, and open a portal. He had trained her to his schedule, and now she was training him to her exploration. So it was that months on Himari's timeline and years in the real world quickly passed by. She would travel through the pattern of the clear place to a safe spot in the real world where she would find food and enchantment for herself, where she would find food and entertainment for herself and the cat, before White Paw grew restless and decided to look for a change of scenery somewhere else. 6 years after her first disappearance, Himari had become a nursery rhyme in the elementary schools. Perhaps she would have continued adding verses to the ghost story following her over the coming decades if she had not seen the older man with the gray eyes from her island in the sky. That old man was not where he was supposed to be. Also, he was the first man Himari had seen in the clear place, and he owned something sparkly. From her island, she could see him holding it, and when the light went through that sparkling thing, there was a golden glow all around him. He regarded the sparkling thing as he walked, then put it away. She had to see what this sparkling thing was, even if it meant there was a schedule change. A schedule could be changed for a treasure, and this man had a treasure, and this man wasn't supposed to be there, so her course was clear. Himari compelled Whitepaw, and after several jumps, she came out of the wall of the mountain beside the peaceful man. Fed the cat after he reached the portal Himari compelled Whitepaw, and after several jumps, she came out of the wall of the mountain beside the peaceful man. Fed the cat after he reached the portal closed, and not meeting the gray eyes of the stranger, said, "Who are you?" The man stopped and stared at her several minutes. His vestments were tattered. Under the head of a bear fur coat like a rug, he wore a deep black beard with colonies of gray. It looked as though it hadn't been touched with scissor or razor in years. His hair was also shot through with gray, but his face was not old, and he did not look weak. He spoke in a tongue Himari did not know. Even so, for some reason, she had no trouble understanding him. He said, "I am Rohan Hanuman, the stoic, the sly, the spicer, whelp of the mighty hunter and would-be king slayer." "Himari Fujimoto," and she held out her hand sideways. He looked at it, then grasped it gently, bowing low before straightening and somehow compelling her to meet his eyes. The next thing he said was, "How have you come here?"